Yeah, it's a massive, the way you describe it, you see it's just this massive power play, the dollar,
Yeah.
that started off in the ruins of Europe. And, I'm in London here, and we know that all these countries destroyed each other. And then the US kind of walked in, made the rules, and then kept pushing that power play in all these various forms into where we are today. The funny thing is, Alex, is that I studied economics at MIT, Sloan School of Business. I went to Wall Street, and they never taught me this stuff. Most people in finance
Me
don't
too.
necessarily, right? They,
Yeah.
they don't necessarily even know the history of the world they're in. And they don't know all the
Well,
connotations of it. Go
what's
ahead.
really interesting is that this whole, like the petrodollar thing was just glaringly obvious, and of course is now being discussed at length by Credit Suisse analysts and all kinds of people. Where everybody's now talking about, oh my God, what happens if energy gets priced in a different currency? Um, Even a year ago, when I first came out with this research on the petrodollar, I mean, and certainly before that, it was considered like conspiracy theory stuff that like Ron Paul would do. And you know, it's crazy because you go back to the 70s again, this was like a totally talked about thing. Like the petrodollar thing was, there's tons of JSTOR academic research on it. For whatever reason, it got memory hold in the 2000s. And in my book, I suggest, a provocative thesis that may be part of why it was memory hold. In the end of the 90s, there was a challenger to the dollar, is the euro, right? So you had all the nations of Europe coming together. You go back to the late 90s, early 2000s, like people were legitimately concerned that the euro would take over the dollar, right? I'm sure you saw this from your perspective.
Yeah.
All the newspapers were, I mean, even if deep down fund managers didn't believe it or whatever, certainly it was discussed. It was like out there and discussed. And when the euro came out, it was quite strong against the dollar. Everybody remembers this. And look, one of the things that started to happen was the petro euro was born. This idea of like oil countries selling and denominating currency in euros. And this is very important. It's not just about the sale. If you think about it, there's so many things that happen in an oil transaction. There's not just the sale; it's the insurance you have to pay, right, for your shipment. It's the derivatives on top. That for every barrel of oil, there's like way more derivatives, like in an order of magnitude more than the barrel itself. So you're talking about all those things start to be priced in other currencies. That's an enormous network effect, pulling demand away from the dollar, right? So the U.S. government saw this clearly. Saddam Hussein announced at 99 he would do this, right? And then he did it. And he was selling billions of dollars and billions of dollars worth of oil in euros um, to Germany, France, European countries in 2000 and 2001, 2002. I think he sold something like $25 billion worth of energy, over that time. Um, and in euros. And I think his country was like, at the time, definitely a top 10, but maybe even a top 5 oil producer. Okay. So what's really interesting is if you just look at it from sort of first principles, um, the petro euro was a thing and it could have easily started to spread, right? Other countries that produce oil in the region may started to look at this. Okay. And then after the invasion of Iraq, what's one of the first things that happened? And this is again in the mainstream media noted. This is not like some conspiracy theory. In June of 2003, the new Iraqi government went back to selling oil in dollars again. So I mean that you can say that it's coincidence or whatever, but the reality is that Saddam was selling oil in euros, created the petro euro, which is a rival to the petrodollar, and then he got taken out. And maybe you want to say it's coincidence, but you know what? Like the Iraq war is so crazy. As someone who was in high school during 9/11 and who watched the whole Iraq war thing, really shaped my worldview. Like there is no good explanation for the Iraq war, just none. Like clearly wasn't for democracy. No one could possibly believe that. It wasn't to push back against Iran. Iran got a lot more powerful in the region afterwards, quite obviously, because we took out the Sunnis and the Shias now run the country. Um, I mean, literally, like Saddam was the one that we were funding to fight the Iranians in the 80s. So that doesn't make any sense. It definitely wasn't WMDs. That was all a lie. And this idea that it's um, for terrorism was also a joke. There was no connection at all. In fact, the invasion of Iraq later created ISIS in Iraq. Like, so
All a power play.
None of the official explanations make any sense. So there's still this like search for why did we invade? No one really knows. I mean, we speak of it in vague terms, and it wasn't about oil per se. Like America didn't get very much by that point. Like the US got most of its oil from its own oil fields, from Canada, from Mexico, from Venezuela. Like it got a very tiny percentage of its oil from the Middle East. I mean, Europe was more reliant, but we just weren't that connected. But if you start to think about the architecture of the petrodollar system, well, we had to protect the Saudis. That was part of the deal. And I very much think that it makes as much sense as anything else, that we wanted to protect the system that made possible our geopolitical power projection. What made possible our geopolitical power projection was the fact that energy was priced in dollars, and therefore finance was priced in dollars. And that's going to start to crumble. And we won't be able to do the same power projection. And in a recent essay that I wrote after the book came out, I really explored this idea of quantitative easing and war and how they're connected. And it's so interesting because historically, at least in America, my country, but also it's pretty similar among most democracies, wars used to be fought with taxation and war bonds, or they would call them liberty bonds or whatever. So, when Keynes came out with his book, How to Pay for the War, like in World War II in Britain, I mean, it was about taxation. And you go back and you read Kant and Mill and Smith and all these people, and they said governments shouldn't borrow for war, but if they have to, they really need to tax for it. So you had this situation where, like, at least in America, like World War I, World War II, Korea, all these wars were paid for by taxation and borrowing. The American people during World War II, 85 million Americans bought Liberty bonds to the tune of what is now $3 trillion. Okay. So Americans, what I'm saying is that they were very involved in war making, even if they didn't go themselves. And they did go themselves. We had conscription, obviously. Everybody knew someone abroad. It was very different. And even if you didn't fight, you were paying for it and you knew it. Okay. So these wars the people were connected to the war. Like it was a thing that we were connected to. But after the 60s, Johnson tried to raise taxes for the Iraq war. It ended up being one of the last things he did. And then he left office. I mean, he made him very unpopular. So since 68, there's never been a war tax in the United States. And we've never done any significant Liberty bond sales again. And all of our wars since have been paid for on credit card, called the credit card wars. All the post 9/11 wars were paid by borrowing. And this is really only possible if your interest rates are low, right? So if your interest rates are high, you can't afford these wars. I'll give you an example. So we're seeing this now, right, in the last few months, but like when the interest rate was when the Fed overnight rate was like 0.08%, which was a few months ago. Okay. So it meant that like bonds were 1% or 2% or whatever. For every 100 basis point increase in the interest rate, if you have $30 trillion in debt as a country, that's $300 billion more dollars that you have to pay this year to your bondholders, right? So you start talking about a 3% increase in rates. Okay, that's almost another $1 trillion. The federal budget for 2022 that Biden has projected is $6 trillion, and we only have 4.3 trillion of that covered by revenue through taxation, et cetera. So we already have an overhang of 1.7.